So every time there seems to be diplomatic progress towards a peace deal over the Ukraine war, Russia responds in the same way. Known as an escalation ladder, it's a very predictable pattern after a while. As we saw over the weekend, heinous attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, missile barrages, drone waves, things hit at scale. But now, to me, there is something even more revealing over the latest developments just today. While talks between Trump and Zelensky were framed as productive, Moscow has claimed Ukraine has tried to strike one of Putin's own residencies. Now, of course, Kyiv immediately and strenuously denies this, but it isn't random, it's a pattern, an indication of something much bigger emerging from behind the scenes, but that Moscow would never outrightly admit, and if anything, prefer to cover up. Because whenever diplomacy gains traction, especially when Ukraine is seen as reasonable, constructive, or compromising, the Kremlin reaches for that coercion. So in this video, I wanted to look at these latest developments around the alleged attack, the less immediate visible pattern that is occurring here, where military pressure and carefully timed outrage aren't meant to convince everyone, but to subtly distort the diplomatic terrain, cast doubt over Zelensky's supposed compromises, and quietly assert Moscow's control over that escalation cycle. Stick around for this one. There's something I do not think you will have expected.
This is the Global Gambit.
How you going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we look at geopolitics, economics, international relations, and the logic behind today's conflicts, without the hype and without any wishful thinking. Now, if you've been following this story, as many of you likely have done, then we're going to unpack something that feels quite familiar. These escalations and the subsequent claims by Moscow do occur, and we see them historically. In 2014, as negotiations followed Russia's seizure of Crimea, Moscow quietly escalated in the Donbass. A year later, over the Minsk talks, ceasefires were announced, but then violated almost immediately, and, well, often moments when Kyiv was most under pressure to compromise. The lesson is consistent. For the Kremlin, diplomacy is not a path away from coercion, it's another arena in which coercion can be applied. And so, as we go through this, especially the key takeaway for you later on in the video, I want you to add your comments below. What do you think about these developments, about the claims? Is there anything new here? To me, just a little bit. So, after the meeting in Mar-a-Lago on Sunday, Trump declared the talks with Zelensky excellent, and that a breakthrough was getting closer. Now, Zelensky has publicly echoed such cautious optimism. Military aspects of the peace framework were fully agreed on. But the key detail, the core demand of Ukraine about long-term US security guarantees, it remains unresolved. Washington has offered 15 years versus Kyiv, who is looking for double that, possibly as long as 50 years. Now, Zelensky's logic is blunt and hard to argue with. Russia has violated Ukrainian sovereignty for over 10 years, and then, of course, with the full-scale invasion, this is not something that Ukraine can take again at just face value. A 15-year promise is not enough to deter Moscow. It simply potentially delays the next war, giving Russia enough time to rearm, reorientate, and re-escalate. For Kiev, security guarantees are essentially the entire deal, as without them, any ceasefire simply becomes this pause. And we've often seen that pauses in military events in warfare often favour the offensive side, not the defensive side, as in Ukraine's situation. Now, unsurprisingly, Trump has obviously made it clear that Europe will have to shoulder most of this burden, which is not reassurance for the Ukrainians, it's strategic ambiguity. And ambiguity that is exactly what Moscow welcomes, prays for, and can exploit most effectively. And so this is where the pattern is impossible to ignore whenever diplomacy advances, but most especially between the United States and Ukraine. Russia escalates militarily. It's a reflection of the way that Putin sees the world, that great power politics defines engagement, why he always focuses on the United States, and why his rumblings about Europe in the past couple of weeks, as I made in another video, are very revealing. And it's also reflective of what we've seen over the years of this war, that whenever there seems to be moments where there is more patience, especially in the Trump administration, over Ukraine's plight, the Russians respond by blanketing the country in airstrikes, or as we saw over the weekend, heinous attacks on the capital and absolutely devastating civilian infrastructure. And then immediately after these talks on Sunday, framed as being constructive, Moscow introduces a new escalation. What prompted me to make this video? Not on the battlefield, but in the narrative space. Russia claims that a drone attack was launched on one of Vladimir Putin's official residencies, Dolgoye Borodye, a secluded retreat used by Soviet and Russian leaders throughout history. Now, according to Moscow, their narrative is that 91 range drones were intercepted in the Novgorod region. No evidence has been provided, of course, or no damage reported, and it remains unclear, although pretty likely, that Putin wasn't even there. Ukraine has also obviously flatly denied these allegations, Zelensky calling it a typical Russian lie. Pretty acute, I think, warning that such claims are routinely used to justify further attacks and derail diplomatic momentum. And that is the crux of this video, which is that this doesn't just look like escalation. It looks like a classic false flag style maneuver, or at the very least, a deliberately inflated incident, designed to do three things, arguably four, that's easy to miss. This isn't really about convincing analysts or journalists in real time. It's about pre-positioning blame, shaping the explanation, the narrative that gets used after the diplomacy stalls. And so if the talks harden, slow, or completely collapse, the story's already there. Russia didn't walk away from peace. It reacted to provocation. Firstly, to delegitimise Zelensky, just as his peace proposals are being apparently taken more seriously by Washington. Secondly, to reframe Ukraine as the aggressor, muddying moral clarity at a critical diplomatic moment in which those on YouTube will have a field day over. And third, to give the Kremlin political cover to harden its position without openly rejecting the talks, something we've seen at least 3 or 4 times this year. Russia's officials quickly warned that they would now review their negotiating position, while Putin's top aide said the incident would not go unanswered. In other words, the message wasn't really ever about the drones, it's about control. And the timing, of course, tells you everything. This wasn't designed to trigger an immediate escalation. It was designed to create optionality. If talks continue, the allegations can quietly fade. If talks stall, it becomes justification. And if Russia escalates, it becomes retroactive proof, in the sense that this isn't and wasn't a trigger, it was a placeholder. This claim emerging precisely when Ukraine's compromises are being well received, offering Moscow a way to derail the process while blaming Kyiv for the fallout. It's a maneuver that we see time and again when Russia's options are being constrained. Escalation, therefore, real or manufactured, is restoring that leverage. Now, before continuing, I wanted to ask that if you like to read, do you want deeper dives and written analysis with an occasional British flair or quick wit? Then do join me on Substack, where I am producing much more content now and breaking apart things even more than I do here, and in ways that YouTube is a little bit more sensitive about. Link in the description or pinned comment. Now, this context is essential for understanding what has developed since. After the allegation, Trump spoke with Putin, where, according to the Kremlin readout at least, Putin personally raised the alleged attack and warned that Russia's negotiating posture would change. But the point is that all this is very much about Russia aiming at one specific audience, Donald Trump. The implicit message is quite simple, that you're trying to make a deal and your counterpart is acting with disingenuous intent. They can't control the escalation. And it's therefore the talks will fail not because Russia rejected the peace, but because Ukraine is the obstructor. It's a very specific but repeatable pressure tactic because it allows Moscow to project emotional impact without verification, shape that narrative while Washington tries to keep the process alive. Trump's impatience with Ukraine grows again, and he understands that perhaps Putin is the longer-term, more reasonable guy. That all comes after he said that Putin wants Ukraine to succeed. As I think it's important to do on the channel, I like to consider the harsh realities, uncomfortable truths, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. Not because I agree with them, but because they're there and they're not going away. In this case, though, because also Zelensky doesn't necessarily need to win these talks right now. He just needs to ensure he doesn't lose Ukraine's backers. Holding out or strategic endurance is a strategy in its own right. Europe is buying time, be it financially, militarily, and politically. We're seeing the shifts, and I like to believe that they will make a difference over time, but they need time. Ukraine is absorbing pressure long enough to prevent abandonment. But the real clock everyone watching isn't about military, it's electoral. From Kyiv's perspective, survival through the next political cycle in Washington, or perhaps if the midterms are more favorable to a sympathetic part of the US electorate, then that will benefit Ukraine. From Moscow's perspective, though, the calculation is, of course, different. Russia's military has already exposed itself as far weaker than advertised, relying on these conscripts, the prisoners, and the attritional brutality that has come to define it historically and to sustain its current campaign. And that doesn't make Putin desperate for peace. It makes him desperate to lock in gains, freeze the conflict, and prevent exhaustion, be it on the battlefield or his economic situation. Which is why the Kremlin keeps pushing for outcomes that look like peace, but function much more like surrender and capitulation for the Ukrainians, or what he would ideally prefer, also more broadly, Europe as well. With all that to consider, then, what does it mean could happen next? Well, in the short to medium term, of course, things can change within a few hours. There are three likely paths. Firstly, Russia continues to escalate around the diplomacy rather than abandoning it. That means more strikes timed around the talks, more allegations designed to shift blame, and more efforts to portray Ukraine as the reckless and disingenuous party, just as when it actually appears constructive and suggesting it's willing to discuss a free economic zone in the occupied territories. The goal isn't to end the negotiations for Moscow, it's just to hollow them out. Secondly, pressure intensifies on Ukraine to prove that it is a reasonable side. That means louder calls, especially from the Trump administration, to show flexibility on the territory, the security guarantees, or sequencing, even as Russia offers basically nothing in return. This is where the false narratives matter most. Once moral clarity is blurred, pressure becomes asymmetric, but always in favor of Moscow if it's from the US, or at least from Trump. Thirdly, the longer this drags on, the more Moscow bets on political change rather than battlefield success. If Ukraine can be held in limbo, neither defeated but neither fully secured, time itself becomes a Russian asset, which is why Zelensky's core objective is always about the endurance. Not victory in negotiations, but survival through them. Can he sustain perhaps his leadership? He's even willing to hold elections, as we know, be it though the pressure from the greater powers be. Trump always believes that he seems to be closer on peace. Zelensky and Europe are trying to stop Ukraine from being thrown under the bus. And Putin is, of course, exploiting diplomacy itself as a tool of pressure. This process, therefore, isn't reconciliation. It's about the leverage, the strategic endurance, and most fundamentally, the narrative control by claiming false flags, which therefore legitimizes their ability to use coercion as a means of defending themselves. And until security guarantees are real, long-term, and enforceable, there is no peace. It's just another intermission on this roundabout merry-go-round that we are, unfortunately, experiencing. But that's it from me in this latest update, everyone. If you enjoyed the video, then do give it a like. Consider subscribing if you wish. And as I said, look in the description below for links to join me on Substack, but also if you want to buy me a coffee or support me in other ways. Thanks very much, and I'll see you all soon.